Carissima Tiziana, alla fine del suo fellowship, Tiziana Andina ci onorerà con un discorso interessantissimo. Lei durante il suo soggiorno ci ha illuminati tante volte e ci ha avvicinati alla filosofia italiana. Benvenuta Tiziana, sono curioso di apprendere nuove cose sul rapporto tra arte e legge. Only philosophers dare argue about the concept of art. So the rest of the world thinks that's very clear. And yet the respective or a problem that nobody could ever bring a solution to. And yet the respective understanding of what constitutes art has real legal consequences, be it in art and copyright law, or when determining the scope of constitutional protection of artistic freedom. The relationship between law and the art is, however, often characterized by conflicts, and this not only goes for contemporary art. I was so lucky to talk yesterday to Vive in London, and this is a person who really embodies this conflict. Philosopher Professor Dr. Tiziana Andina from Turin has been working on this difficult relationship during her fellowship at the center and has paid particular attention to differences between contemporary and, to put it in a kind of simplified manner, traditional art. Does the nature of conceptual art that is increasingly charged with meaning lead to a new concept of art? And what role is played by the attempt to utilize the règle de l'art in the sense of proprietary normativity of the aesthetic sphere for the purposes of the definitional problem? Tiziana Andina will delve into these issues today in her lecture Embodied Meanings and Normativity for a new concept of art, which will be illustrated with numerous examples offering considerable philosophical insights. In general, I know that you use also elements and exemplars of art in order to verify. This is the way you do your wonderful conferences. Tiziana Andina studied philosophy. What else? At the University of Turin, is that right? Really, you started at Turin? No?
Yeah.
In some years later, she received her PhD with a thesis entitled Friedrich Nietzsche e l'estetica della percezione indiretta. Friedrich Nietzsche and the aesthetics of the indirect perception, to give translation as correct as possible. At the University of Palermo. You are a Sicilian girl, yes? Yeah. Really? So take care. There are always brothers around, always. I know it by experience. Since 2015, she is Associated Professor at the Department for Philosophy of the University of Turin. Professor Andina was a visiting scholar, and this is a really very impressive list, at Columbia University, and a visiting professor and scholar at St. Petersburg State University of Information Technologies, Mechanics and Optics, ITMO, in 2014, and she will be at the end of October, if I see right, for a future project also in the same place, and perhaps in a project that might also be interesting for us, if I understood correctly your invitation to join you. It would be an honor for us. Her research interests focus on the fields of theoretical philosophy, philosophy of art, as well as on ontology and aesthetics. Since March 2015, and still some days, you are a fellow before being transferred into the status, in the post-fellow status. And if this center will reach the status of being a permanent institution of eternity, then I'm very sure that you will become a permanent fellow also. Art as embodied meaning, what does it mean? According to rules, what rules of art and what kind of normativity? What type of, as we say in German, Geltungsanspruch claims the body of meaning? Adesso tocca a te di darci le risposte, perché sono capace di farmi comprendere in italiano. Yes. Scusate.
Thank you very much, and I want to take the advantage of this talk to really thank Werner Gebhardt, Professor Gebhardt, to give me the opportunity to stay and to be here for a short part of my life. This is really an amazing place, which give me the opportunity to take in free time a great conversation with an amazing group of fellows. So it was really an inspiring period to stay and to be here. So thank you very much, Werner, for this opportunity. I would like today to talk to you about, as Werner told very well, about the possibility to give a new definition of the concept of art, and my talk will ideally start from the point on which Gianmaria Ajani stopped his own definition a couple of months ago. The aim of this talk, a subject on which I have been working for a while now, is to close the gap between contemporary and, so to speak, traditional art. This gap is produced due to the lack of comprehension, at least in my opinion, that both the expert and common sense have of so-called contemporary arts. No, this one. I would like begin by referring to the talk given by Gianmaria Ajani here at Käte a couple of months ago. Some of you were here. Gianmaria showed in a very accurate way what are the problems to be faced by the scholar who are dealing in jurisprudence with works of art, especially the contemporary ones. These problems are not raised just from the perspective of scholarship. In fact, our common sense has also been asked to change its standard view on art. Let me explain what I mean by telling you a short piece of popular cartoon series. I think that most of you know the series, obviously. The Simpsons. It's possible to go over the web and to see over the cartoon. Season number 10, episode 19. In this episode, Homer Simpson, the protagonist of the series, is trying to make a DIY barbecue. After many misadventures that frustrate his ambition of making a nice barbecue, Homer tries to return to haul things to the store. As he is driving, a car accident caused the load to fall into the road, and Homer decides to run away without worrying about it. The next day, a young woman who is an art dealer visits Tom, asking him for the permission to organize an exhibition with his work. Without a doubt, it's a work of art. We will not follow Homer in his personal experience in understanding what it means to be an artist and creating a works of art. Here we just want to underline the experience of a common sense view about contemporary art. Such view is well expressed by Margie, Homer's wife, almost at the end of the story. To be an artist was Margie's dreams. To realize this dream, she attended very good schools and practiced a lot. And now Homer, without having done anything, is defined a great artist. This makes no sense. Homer's answer is also inspired by common sense. That is a key point. In his view, to be an artist means to be able to realize well-made artworks, which represent reality in a clear way. In a word, emerges works of art, things look like they are in reality. They are a reproduction of reality. So that is a mimesis in a technical, philosophical language. An important legitimation to this intuition comes from Plato's The Republic, as you probably know, especially book number 10. Drawing his metaphysics of the universe, Plato classified works of art as copies of things which are themselves copies of ideas. Comparing the perfection of the ideal reality of ideas, the reality of the material world is less perfect. This is the metaphysical overview of Plato's thought. At the lowest level of perfection, therefore, we find works of art. At the end of the day, they are copies of a real thing that are in turn copies of idea. It is not my aim to discuss this point in order to distinguish, for example, the role played by philosophy from that played by common sense within the dispute on the real nature of art. My aim is different, indeed, and rather focuses on those cases in which the Platonic framework seems not to work, in particular over the 20th century. A point that was certainly discovered by Plato and that is independent of any particular cultural mindset is that in order to state something about art, it is necessary to state something about the relationship between art and reality. In Plato's view, this relation consists in copying, not just mirroring, parts of reality creating some objects which become in turn part of reality. The arts of 19 showed us basically two things. The first one is that the Platonic way is not the right one to understand art. And the second one is that despite this mistake, the Platonic intuition is correct. To understand the very nature of art, it is necessary to look deeply into the relationship between art and reality. Indeed, it is this relation that has been investigated by contemporary art and especially by the avant-garde. Now, how was this investigation carried out in the 19th century? My sense is that artists either introduce new confusion inside our taxonomies or unveiled some mistakes that were already present at them. Do you remember some of the examples discussed by Ayani? I'm going to recall quickly some of them briefly, as all the cases raised by customs officials make this lack in our taxonomies particularly evident. We can cite at least 3 different situations in 3 different moments in time and 3 different places in the world. Imagine the scene. It was 1926 at the custom of the United States. Bird in Space, that's the title of the works of art, a sculpture by Constantin Brancusi, arrived to New York by sea. Upon inspecting it, custom officials challenged the idea that the strange object was a sculpture, seeing as it in no way resembled a bird. For this reason, they refused to categorize Brancusi's creation as a work of art, preferring to consider it a kitchen utensil. That's the story. It's true. They therefore applied to it the taxation that was normally reserved for merchandise, while works of art were subject to a fiscal exemption. As expected, Brancusi was outraged, and the matter was brought to federal court. Thus began one of the most notorious trials in the history of art, Brancusi versus United States. Edward Steichen, the photographer who had bought the sculpture, explained the affair to Gertrude Whitney, founder of the Whitney Museum of New York, who, upon realizing that the case would become a formidable juridical precedent, offered to cover the legal fees of the trial. 6 members of the jury redounded in Brancusi's favor: Edward Steichen, sculptor Jacob Epstein, the editor of the Journal of Arts, the editor of Vanity Fair, the director of the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and art critic Henry McBride. Marcus Higginbotham represents customs. The U.S. government had 2 jurors as well: sculptor Robert Aiken and Thomas Jones. The states defended the custom officials, recalling a prior case, United States versus Olivotti, from 1916, in which the only artifact that qualified as work of art were those that were recognized. That's why I mentioned Plato and mimetic theory before, recognized as imitation of objects in nature. Remember this point, please. The following are a few lines from the debate. Jude White asked Steichen, "What do you call this?" That. Steichen responded, "I call it what the sculptor called it, use, which means bird." White continues, "How can you say that it is a bird if it does not resemble one?" Steichen, "I'm not saying that it is a bird. I'm saying that it looks like a bird. To me, just that it was stylized and named by the artist." White replies, "And the only reason for which you say it is a bird is because the artist called it one?" Steichen, "Yes, Your Honor." White persists, "If you had seen it on the road, would you have called it a bird? If you had seen it in the forest, would you have shot at it?" Steichen, "No, Your Honor." The trial came to a close on 26 November 1928 with the acknowledgement that Brancusi's work, Bird in Space, was in fact a work of art. In this case, we have an artifact, a sculpture, which does not resemble an object that custom officials are able to identify clearly. The object, which has no clear identity, brings some confusion into the taxonomy of the officials, who consider the artwork as a mere material objects. Knives have a similar shape, perhaps usually. Now, we move to a different place in a different location. The problem is similar, but it's not exactly the same. Brillo box by the great artist Andy Warhol are exhibited in 1964 at the Stable Gallery, very famous gallery in New York. Disembarked in Canada in 1965 in the care of art merchant Gerald Morris. Custom officials yet again classified them as products, specifically boxes from a grocery store, and applied to them the corresponding taxation. Their confusion in reality was understandable. Grocery stores were full of Brillo boxes. They are still right now of Brillo boxes, containing sponges and cleaning pots and pans. An expert was therefore consulted, Mr. Charles Comfort, director of National Gallery of Canada, who, having seen Warhol's works in photographs, supported the opinion of customs officials. Brillo box was not a work of art. The scene is only apparently the same. This time, indeed, the resemblance, the mimetic relationship within the artwork and the material objects is not in question. The Brillo boxes are too similar to Brillo box in grocery store to be a work of art. In the Brillo box's case, the custom official followed a line of reasoning that is contrary to that used in the case of Brancusi's sculpture. Brancusi's sculpture, in fact, did not resemble the part of reality it was named after. Here the question is quite the opposite. Are the Brillo box made by Andy Warhol too similar to the ordinary objects drawn by James Harvard? There is a long story between that I would like to tell you, but we have no time. Comparing the difference between the ordinary objects, Brillo box, which was drawn by another artist, and the copies one drawn by Andy Warhol. And that is another interesting case, but we don't go in it right now. Anyway, are the Brillo boxes made by Andy Warhol too similar to the ordinary objects drawn by James Harvey, an artist and a quite well-known designer, to be a work of art? That's the second question. As we know, common sense is generally very sensitive to this idea. Our naive taxonomies make a distinction between class of work of art and the class of material objects. How it is possible, this is the implicit question posed by inspectors, that something resembling so closely a very common object could be a work of art. At the end of the day, we know that, as Walter Benjamin said, works of art must show at least some properties that they don't share with ordinary objects. An artwork must be original, not reproducible, and unique. The Brillo boxes by Andy Warhol were produced in series, in a huge number of exemplars, inspired by, not to say copied from, ordinary boxes. So, what has to be said about our ontological distinction between the class of works of artworks and the class of ordinary objects, if, as it seems, there are some artworks which are identified by the same properties as ordinary objects? Let me make another example, the final one, showing another problem with our taxonomies. This time it is the work Icons, that's the name of the title of the works, that is passing through European customs. These are works made with fluorescent lights symbolize the icons of our time, and Dan Flavin, the American artist, exhibited them in some of the most prestigious museums in the world. Nevertheless, as was described by The Guardian, custom officials in the European community determined that Flavin's works were light fixtures, and accordingly they had to be subject to the corresponding tool, meaning no offense to the artwork. The art gallery, on the contrary, declared them to be works of art, asking that they be subjected to a value-add tax of 5%, as stated in Chapter 97 of the British Common Customs Tariff. After having interpreted the tariff table and having identified no correspondence between the important objects and the category featured on the list, British customs authorities refused to allow either objects to be classified as work of art. Both objects were subjected to what was then the standard rate of 70.5% and to customs fee of 3.7%. Following the gallery opposition, the London court stated that the objects are work of art and confirmed the applicability of the request task breaks. The conclusion of this incident is noteworthy. A few UN member countries whose custom of offices had dealt with some similar case brought the case to the European Commission that on August 11, 2010 issued a regulation in which it is stated that the sculptures by Dan Flavin cannot be classified as art, but rather as wall-like fittings. As you may note, this case is very similar to Brillo-Bock's case. The custom officer considered the fluorescent light to be ordinary objects. This is why their and our taxonomies do not allow the possibility that an ordinary object could be also a work of art without it having any visible property. I hope that now the framework is quite clear. During the 20th century, most of the artistic production was thought to mass up the chapter division between ordinary objects and works of art. What was the aim of this? In philosophical jargon, we call an operation of this kind a meta-reflection on the meaning and extension of the concept, for example, art, targeted to reconfiguring the idea or even a definition of the concept. The artist evidently wanted to question the traditional view. For them, the relationship between art and reality is not a relation between a model, a reality, and a copy, a work of art. Certainly, works of art are part of reality, but not in the same way as, we may say, the mirror image of Mona Lisa. The relation between art and reality is the core of the definition of the art that was questioned throughout the 20th century. Within this context, it would have been very odd if philosophy had not attempted to respond to a problem posed by both the art world and the whole of society. Now, before starting with my arguments for a new definition of art, I would like to address a couple of methodological points. The first one concerns some expression I will use in my arguments. I will adopt a very basic ontology, composed by three different classes of things: natural objects, artifacts, and ideal objects. By artifacts, I mean all those objects that are entirely created or partially modified by an intentional activity. I will adopt a wide conception of normativity. I will claim that normativity corresponds to the awareness that something can be correct or incorrect, but also that a certain judgment can be better than others. Finally, a few words about my general perspective in philosophy of art. In my idea, it is not a concern of philosophy to establish what is art and what is not. What object is an artwork and what is not. In other words, it is not a task of philosophy to prescribe a normative position that is a set of rules in order to distinguish what is art from what isn't. Instead, philosophy might do a good job in showing good arguments to explain the current state of affairs in the art world. In other words, I prefer a descriptive metaphysics to a prescriptive one. My view, therefore, is in the field of the descriptive metaphysic, and my goal is that of drawing a broad definition of the notion of art, including all types of artworks that have asked for a revision of our taxonomies, mainly through a reconsideration of the relation between art and reality. So, now I would like to present the definition of art on which I have been working, along with some reason to explain why the normativity plays a central role in drawing a much more functional definition. My definition is the following. A work of art is a social and historical object, an artifact which embodies a representation in a form of inscribed trace upon a medium that is not transparent. All three conditions are jointly necessary, and my idea is that condition 2 and 3 meet both in sphere of normativity. Let us start with the first condition. A work of art is a social and historical object. The first condition puts forward two ideas. For an artwork to exist, a social system and the artwork are jointly necessary. What does this mean? Basically, that artworks are artifacts, namely products of human intentionality, which are made in a certain time by people who aim saying something to someone else. The relevant point at this stage is this: a further element seems to be necessary in addition to the existence of a social system. This element is the artwork, which in my perspective is necessary to include contemporary art in the definition of art. But what is the artwork, and why do I suppose it is necessary to include it to draw a new, broader definition? The artwork is a vague concept that, because of its very vagueness, can help us better understand the idea that a social context is necessary for artwork to exist. I will adopt the definition sketched by the American philosopher George Dickey to describe the artwork. I'm quoting. What is the artwork? This is the answer drawn by Dickey. The core personnel of the artwork is a loosely organized but nevertheless related set of persons, including artists, understood to refer to painters, writers, composers, producers, museum directors, museum goers, theater goers, reporters for newspaper, critics for publication of all sorts, art historians, art theorists, philosophers of art, and others. These are the people who keep the machinery of the artwork working and thereby provide for its continuing existence. American philosopher and art critic Arthur Danto used the concept of artwork for the first time in 1974 paper. His aim was to underline that an artwork is made up not only by formal properties, but also by other properties, some depending on the cultural and historical context, other depending on the narrative of the history of art. Both groups of properties meet the intellect, not the senses. Danto never formulated an institutional theory of art. That is, he never intended to say that what is art merely depends on the cultural context. He intended to say that there are several factors which nowadays are certainly of increasing relevance that constitute the inner nature of the work of art, and that the comprehension of this factor is as important as the comprehension of the so-called formal or aesthetic qualities. Elsewhere, I have defined the art world as a quasi-institutional entity. The art world resembles an informal institution, that is to say, a social practice or organization that functions thanks to ingenious and unwritten rules. The action performed by such a quasi-institutions are of a different type compared to those performed by institutional entities. Action performed by institutional entities take place in an endless amount of cases: marriage, university degrees, for example, certification exam, professional practice, the stipulation of a contract, and so on and so forth. In each of these examples, a particular institution, the church, the state, a professional association, etc., has the power to transform an action or even an object into something else by attributing to it a particular function. Think of when a wall becomes a political border, for example, or when the I do of a bride turns into a legally valid promise. The fact that we have an ingenious and the most part vague concept of the art world at our disposal still legitimizes our supposing that it is essentially something, or in other words, a certain type of entity. It is in this fact an entity that emerges from and therefore is bound to be dependent on the elements that form it. The art world exists because museum, artists, artwork, consumer, and art market exist. The institution of the art world is founded upon the union and the integration of all of these elements. In certain cases, the relations seem to be directional. Artists, like Duchamp, exist precisely because an artwork exists. And works of art, such as, for example, Battle Rock, exist because museum and collections, such as Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, exist. Moreover, museum and foundation have been allowed to do what they do by the art world itself, even though the contrary also holds true. The Rauschenberg Foundation exists because works like Duchamp's exist and must be conserved and passed on. In general, art theories refer to two different types of institutions. Following the American philosopher Jeffrey Wynand classification, we can name this institution I institution and P institution. S stands for action and P for person. An I institution is one that produces action whose tokens are instantiations of particular kind of action. These kind of institutions distinguish themselves from others because they produce action that are governed by rules. Two people who wish to be joined in marriage can only do so within an institution where certain rules have been accepted and sanctioned. In other words, an institution produces a sort of conventional act. P institutions, conversely, are understood as quasi-person or agents. They perform action and can be called upon to account for them. In general, P institutions act through members who operate by themselves. Examples might include state officials, the bishop of a church, or the managing director, for example, of a company. A state might celebrate, say, marriage through its official and therefore can perform an institutional act. In short, the distinction between I institution and P institution mark a distinction between institution as acts or type of acts and institution as agents. Whereas in Dick's theory, the art world is made by both types of institutions which play a role in transfiguring a material object into a work of art, I think that art world in many cases provides some instruments to the artist in order to complete his creation and to the public in order to perform a better comprehension of the artworks. In both cases, the artwork is indeed an instrument to better perform the creation or the interpretation. But, and this point is really important, it is not the real maker of works of art. Thus far for the first condition. Now let's just come to the other two conditions. A work of art is I will show you. The first part, a work of art is a social and historical object. Now, to come to the second condition, an artifact which embodies a representation in the form of an inscribed trace, and finally, the third condition, upon a medium that is not transparent. The second condition refers to two elements. The first one is the artifactuality. Works of art are artifacts, that is, material objects created or altered through an intentional action performed by human beings. The relationship between artifact and reality is not, as in Platonic metaphysics, a mimetic one. However, it is centered upon a representation, something that lies at the core of human life. While it is true that perception and representation are both at the core of our experience of the world, it is also true that the artistic representation is structured in a particular way, compared to the non-artistic one. The most important characteristic of the artistic representation are two. To work properly, an artistic representation doesn't need to necessarily be realistic, nor does it to have to grasp the reality as it is. However, the artistic representation, depiction, as it is called in a philosophical language, has to embody the artistic route to you. Work of art, along with our belief, carry representation that are intentional. This means that while in epistemic activities we are dealing with the truth, in depiction artists have no obligation to deal with the truth. We do not need to carry out any sort of inquiry into the real world to understand Don Quixote. To go to the text and follow the plot is enough, as well as convenience. Certainly, if we were to possess subsidiary knowledge of the life of knights errant, our understanding of the novel would improve, but we would not have so much as an additional ounce of knowledge. Words do not say anything about the world if not incidentally, and, as it often said, accidentally. In other words, a tourist is not likely to choose to walk the street of Manhattan by relying on Chauvel's novel Where New York Ends, instead of a lonely travel guide. The novel could perhaps be extremely accurate in its representation of the city, but whether it truly is so is a question that concerns the author choice. It is for this reason that we can understand and imagine, let's say, a representation of the Sphinx, without having to ask ourselves if a lion with a human head really exists in an Egyptian desert. In general, then, we understand and imagine, that is to say, we classify it in a proper way, or we identify its representational content without knowing if what it depicts actually exists. We understand its meaning, and this is enough. The third condition is about the way in which a depiction can be embodied in a medium. This marks the singularity of each work of art and determines the artistic quality. My sense is that this third condition needs to be further investigated if we want to better explain the definition. Differently from all forms of scientific knowledge which are used to embody representation in structured and articulated concepts, work of art embody raw ideas, not only using words, but also several other media. And in those cases in which words are used, we have to remember that they embody intentional representation. In any case, the intentional representation embodied is structured in such a way that work of art usually says something on a double level. The artist says something about something, the first level, through the representation, and the medium, which is composed by representation plus the physical qualities of the objects, say something about the world. This is a specific culture, a particular historical era, and so on. Let me try to explain by referring to some examples. A cross is an age-old semantic object with an history that predates its use throughout Christianity. If we consider its modern day meanings, those which are able to decipher without the help of reading guides, the following come to mind: the death of Jesus, the presence of a church, a hospital, a cemetery or a tomb, a pharmacy, a street intersection, or a dead-end street. The matter is quite simple and can be formulated in these terms. For what reason is that cross, which is the signal, is not a work of art, while this one and this other one are both work of art. The cross in these slides represent a dead end on a street sign, while these other two depict two works by imaginative and polyvalent French artist Käte. In his cross, the artist evidently embodies a new meaning. In Abraham's works, the road seen in the shape of cross become a real cross. Hence the first image, which displays this one, which displays a stylized body hanging from a pool with no way out, just as the dead-end street depicted on the street sign, and the second image, this one, which quotes the most classic and widely known deposition from the cross. What is the difference between these and normal signs that also have a representative content? This is the central point. Both type of image have a representative content, but it's supposed to be a difference between the artistic one and the non-artistic one. Abraham's representation are contained in a medium, that is a canvas, which says something about the idea of sacredness in the postmodern era, hanging on walls and found along the street of Florence. The signs are looked at because of what they are, and not because of the classic meaning that they embody. The warning, this is the classic meaning, obviously, the warning of a dead-end street. Abraham Signon, along with many other works in contemporary art, is particularly rich, as it presents a stratified plurality of meanings. There are the meanings exemplified by the street sign and those implemented by the artist. Both meanings are greatly singular. The cross is a dead-end road. A man who has been crucified, who is taken down from a cross and lies in the arms of a grieving mother, like this one, represent the expression of that which is, in the most definitive way, death. There is no trace of transcendence in the representation of a man hanging from a cross depicted on a street sign, nor is there in its exposition to the distracted passers-by. Yet it is not a sacred place that conserves and protects the power of dead symbols. These facts, in particular, make it clear how the medium not only embodies the depiction by the artist, but also plays a central role in doing this in a way that says something about the culture in which Abraham works. A culture in which art is made popular and accessible through the popular use of its icons, for example, including religious ones. These icons are not used to offer a figurative narration to the story of the Christianity. Rather, this narration is reconfigured to say something about the era in which such reconfiguration takes place. In the open work, Umberto Eco says something similar, where he says that works of art give us picture of a reality that hold as epistemological metaphors. Eco rightly notes that works of art possess a double semantics. In fact, they are epistemic metaphor, which means that they say something about something through representation, and that they say something through the structure of their body, the medium. That's the quotation from the open work. Art as structuring of forms has its own ways of talking about the world and man. It may happen that a work of art makes statement about the world through its topic, as in the subjects of a novel or in a poem. But first of all, as forms, art makes statements about how it is structured, showing the historical and personal trends that have led to it, and that implicit worldview manifested by a certain form. Now, that all conditions that make up my definition have been explained, I would like to come back to the question of normativity briefly. I mentioned that ever since Duchamp introduced the ready-made in a museum, alongside the traditional works of art, the ontological question has become urgent. Stated differently, the important caesura determined by contemporary art, specifically by the Dada movement and abstract expressionism, seems to really question the idea that the access to understanding of art is given by sensibility. The whiteness of the urinal, the properties of a color white, was certainly not the reason that prompted Duchamp to present a urinal built in a series at an art competition. As the artist himself explained, he didn't expect the audience to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of Fontaine, quite the contrary. If anything, the opposite was true. Duchamp was interested in the anesthetic dimensions, since his goal was to create a work of art prescinding from the use of traditional aesthetic properties, first of all, beauty. The pursuit of anestheticness is what distinguishes ready-mades from abstractism, in which, think for example to works of Malevich, color is still a determinant element. In other words, Malevich abstract paintings are surely closer to figurative paintings than Fontaine and other ready-mades. In fact, for the latter, it does not seem possible to appeal to any judgment of taste, and consequently, there seems to be no aesthetic normativity to which to refer. The hypothesis that I intend to verify at this stage is that the issue of normativity in contemporary art is subject to a revision of definition of the very concept of art. The key point in the case of the judgment of taste is the question of its universality, and therefore its normativity. For a long time, aesthetic normativity has had as its prerequisite the idea of beauty. As stated by Immanuel Kant, we expect that anyone who has seen or will see the Mona Lisa, for example, can only find it beautiful, and therefore can only express the exact same judgment. It therefore seems that there is a tension between the idea of judgment of taste, for example, judgment that generally relates to matters subject to taste are subjective, and the idea that they aspire to achieve broad, even universal consensus. In other words, they seem to be both subjective, individual, and objective, normative. So the judgment of taste claims to be normative, to establish itself as a rule that applies to everyone, not just the one who formulates it. However, since artists freed themselves from beauty, the bond between art and the universality of judgment of taste has become problematic. In the reshaping of the concept of art that I'm sketching here, the trace of meaning and the body of the artwork are fundamental, while the aesthetic properties of medium are secondary. In other words, the artwork may or may not be beautiful, whatever this means. Therefore, it may or may not exhibit aesthetic properties, but the latter are not necessary condition for its identity. It seems that there is no normativity of the judgment of taste that can be applied to contemporary art. Let me make another observation from the point of view of the history of concept. One of the most successful readings of all events and self-transformation that art has imposed on itself in the 20th century is the one formulated by Arthur Danto on the basis of what had already been somehow intuited by Hegel in the Phenomenology of Spirits, where he saw that art's fate was to be resolved in the philosophy. In The End of Art, Danto argues that avant-garde, which pursue art to reverse the limits of its own definition, brought it to reach the extreme limits of its possibility, or rather of its own development. That's why the art won't have a progressive development such as the one reconstructed by Vasari, but will rather be the expression of single individuals. The history of art as a history of progress perhaps has to come to an end, at least according to what we can see from the historical perspective in which we find ourselves. What must be noted is that through the 20th century, art has lost its possibility to call for the universality of the judgment of taste, as well as historical and progressive development. Danto suggests not to look at these losses with nostalgia. After all, the counterpart of all this is a great gain, that is the most absolute liberty that artists have won, breaking the canons, cultural tradition, and finally freeing themselves from demand on their patrons. Our post-historical dimension allows us to draw a conclusion as to the issues of normativity. From our historical perspective, we know that normativity of the judgment of text is not about art. And on the other hand, we have also reached a more meaningful understanding of the concept of art. We know that visual arts, in their various forms, belong to the domain of sensible cognition, and we know that the trace of meaning is of great importance to a work of art, more than its aesthetic properties. In the contemporary art, therefore, it no longer makes sense to refer to the normativity of the aesthetic judgment, while, in my sense, is that certainly normativity exists for what concerns the ways in which the semantic trace is incorporated in an artwork. An artwork really works, which means it is successful, in all those cases in which the significant trace is embodied in an appropriate ways so that the viewers can have some kind of cognitive response, which can sometimes be also characterized in emotional terms. Let me reach the conclusion with an example. Ursula Biemann is a Swiss artist who tried to render through her lens both the psychological and social dynamics of migration. For example, you may see a work of art named Sahara Chronicle. And the transgenerational effects of phenomena like the exploitation of natural resources and climate change. You can see deep water for this case. Biemann deals with video art, and more precisely with what the artist defines video essays. To clarify this neologism, we might refer to the idea that art, all art, embodies meanings. Biemann seems to be convinced of this to the point of comparing her production, video, to a category that normally does not refer to art genres, but rather to scientific works, he says. Deep Weather is a video essay, which is different from a video story. The aim is not simply to record facts, but to offer a worldview related to these facts, which are recorded. This means that the artist is fully aware of the artistic scope of her work, as well as of the artistic scope they make the artistic one even more powerful. Another interesting element concerns the use of the emotional element, which is generally very present in art and which we would expect to be present even more significantly in works such as those by Biemann, as they address issues with a high emotional impact. Yet the artist decides to make her work unemotional. If the mass media tend to underline the emotional aspect of these issues through a violent use of images, Biemann presents the problem in eminently critical terms. While the emotion is reduced to zero, the two video essays are strongly characterized in aesthetic terms. They are certainly very beautiful, not only made using a sophisticated technique, but also endowed with a strong aesthetic elements. I would like to show.
towards hurling wings forming within circular motion, approaching in lightning speed. The meteorological station sends signals, and efforts are made to bring within a scientific order the sea and its storm systems.
Okay, I come to the conclusion. There is a double normativity in Beeman videos essays. The first regards the structure of the medium, the second concerns the structure of the semantic trace embodied in the medium. The work doesn't speak to us at the emotional level. And the decrease between the narrated horror and the unemotional way in which it is narrated is so evident that it has to be outcome of a specific artistic choice. The combination of these two elements makes it so that the semantic trace Beeman's works it grasps through an evident communicational short circuit. The tragedy is detached from emotion, but juxtaposed to the weakness of the normative and theoretical framework of the Western culture. From this weakness derives a strongly ethical and political slot. After all, Beeman adds nothing to the chronicle of migration. She goes through it, follows closely, renders it accessible to the audience in short time. Nevertheless, there is only one way to respond to this artwork, as it demands both a universal and an individual response. We must question the foundation and meaning of Western values and reconsider our idea of humanity. Thank you.